3, 2, 1. Please start.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the IRAC webinar on religion and religious extremism throughout history. I'll start with introducing myself. I'm Alison Kaplan-Summer, a journalist at Haaretz. I feel like neither of my panelists really needs an introduction, but they both certainly deserve one. Professor Yuval Noah Harari, a historian and philosopher, is considered one of the world's most influential public intellectuals of the moment. It seems hard to believe that only 5 years ago he was a Hebrew University professor who turned his popular lectures into a book. Since then, that book has become an international phenomenon, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. He has followed that up with more books, Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, and most recently, Sapiens, A Graphic History. Altogether, his books have sold 27.5 million copies in 60 different languages. His books have been fixtures on the New York Times bestseller lists. They've been recommended by people like Barack Obama, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, and many others. He's given keynote speeches at the World Economic Forum annual meeting in Davos, and he regularly discusses global issues with heads of state and leaders of industry. Last year, Yuval Noah Harari and Itzik Yahav, his partner, co-founded Sapienship, an organization whose mission is to clarify the global conversation, focus attention on the most important challenges, and support the quest for solutions. So in that vein, Professor Harari is generously offering his knowledge and time to various organizations and audiences on a voluntary basis, including this conversation with IRAC. He's taking part in this event in order to participate in an open, in-depth discussion on religious extremism and related topics. And so it's important to note that his participating doesn't signify any endorsement of IRAC, or he's not a representative of the center. Our other participant, Anat Hoffman, on the other hand, as we all know, is very much a representative of IRAC, having served as its head since April 2002, fighting the good fight against religious coercion and for religious pluralism. Anat previously served as a member of the Jerusalem City Council for 14 years and has been active in organizations like the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, the Israel Women's Network, and Women in Black. Beginning in 1988, she has served as chairwoman of Women of the Wall, who fight for the rights of women to pray and read Torah at the Western Wall. Before we start our conversation, I'll let you know we'll have some time for audience questions at the end. So if you have something that you'd like to ask, please feel free to ask them in the chat. So Yuval Noah Harari is all about the big picture. So let's start with talking about religion in general and specifically religious extremism. Yuval, with your permission, we'll go Israeli style. I'll call you Yuval and Anat.
Yes, yes.
You'd think if you have a belief system, you believe the values and practices of your belief system, your religion are good and right and moral. The more of them you perform, the more religious you are, the better you will be. Because if a little moral structure and regulation is good, more should be better, isn't it? But why doesn't it work that way with religion? Why across the sweep of history do we see these examples of religious extremism as being more destructive than constructive? Can you talk about some of these examples? And has there ever been an example of religious extremism working for good and not for problems in the world?
Well, there are so many things to talk about in this respect that I'll try to focus. First, there are examples, but again, then you don't call them extremism. It's a lot about definitions. But in general, all religions preach or encourage a wide range of values and a wide range of practices. And, people are lazy. So they tend to skip the more difficult parts, like overcoming hatred and developing compassion, which is very difficult. And instead, they take just one part or several parts out of this broad range of values and commitments, and they take them to extreme, because that's easier. It's easier both in practice and even mentally. We are lazy. As human beings, the human mind maybe one of the most important things to know about it is that it's lazy. Now, I think that true spirituality and true morality is about moderation and balance. The world is complicated, life is complicated, you have a lot of commitments. Finding a good balance between all of them is difficult. The easy thing to do, the lazy thing to do, is to take one and then go to extreme with it and think that, you know, I don't need to develop compassion. I don't need to work on my hatred or my anger because I'm so dedicated to this one value or to this one commandment. And that compensates for everything else. So, you know, it's not just Judaism, of course. You have Christians that they somehow kind of ignore or forget that Christ talked about compassion, that Christ talked about if somebody slaps you, then you should give him your other cheek. And you have the Inquisition, and you have the Crusades. And it's all coming from this deep misunderstanding of what morality means. That I think that morality, I mean, the really difficult thing about morality is moderation and finding balance. And in almost every religion, and also almost every secular ideology, people are looking for shortcuts. And the shortcuts are usually to take one item out of this long and complicated list and focus only on that.
Anat, do you want to address how this relates to what you've experienced with Women of the Wall at the Western Wall? You are constantly confronted with people characterizing the most extreme form of Judaism as the most authentic form of Judaism, and your battle, I think, is against that that portrayal. Am I right?
Look, the thing about the wall is that I haven't heard in 32 years of struggle one iota of a real theological issue with the Women of the Wall. I heard a lot about the 12 million visitors coming every year. I heard what would happen if there was an alternative, other plaza, if there were another plaza right next to the plaza we know today, where there would be an egalitarian plaza, where Women of the Wall and the Reform and the conservative movement will be running the show. I hear what would happen because of the 12 million visitors, so many of them would actually choose to go to a place where there is no partition, where grandma doesn't have to stand in a plastic chair to try to see with binoculars her grandson having a bar mitzvah, where women can dance and pray and celebrate with the Torah. This will certainly dampen the exclusivity of the current plaza. And this has to do with funding and power and having a monopoly. We are trying to break the monopoly at the wall, which is, in my opinion, the center of gravity of religious coercion in the state of Israel. That's what makes it such an important struggle. And many of the people who are fighting against us see it as their own unique territory. And they feel that any challenge to their territory is challenge to God, and they have a holy war against us. You know, I'm reminded that years ago when the Pope came to Israel, the Rabbi of the Wall demanded that when he comes to the wall, he'll take off his crucifix. And when I objected, and of course everyone at the Pope's entourage objected, the rabbi said that when the Pope comes to the mosque, he will take off his shoes. So when he comes to our wall, he should take off the crucifix. I spent a whole day in different television studios trying to explain the difference between a crucifix and shoes. As I found out, the Pope wears Pradas, an orange Pradas. And I think it's fine that he will take off his shoes when he goes to a mosque because the shoes are not his identity, but his crucifix is. And I wonder whether the state of Israel should feel confident enough to allow the Pope to come with his crucifix, to let women of the wall come with their Torah scrolls, to allow Reform conservative congregations to come and pray as they are, as a group, and to allow a handicapped person to come on Shabbat with a battery-operated wheelchair without having him turn it off so he can't move on a Shabbat. There are, I think, the idea of pluralism, tolerance, and equality are subversive, and I'm proud to be fighting for them.
Yuval, you agreed to be on this webinar and have a dialogue with Anat, who you mentioned, I believe, in one of your books in Homo Deus, if I'm not mistaken. As a historian, how would you frame her struggle? How would you frame this battle for the wall? And does it have any kind of a wider importance? And how do you think it will be sort of viewed in a historical context?
I don't know how the future will view it, because the future is not determined yet. It depends on our actions. In very general terms, I would say that religions are changing all the time. Many people think that religions are as some kind of eternal truth that came down from heaven in a complete form, and we just have to preserve it as it is. But it's never true, at least not from a historical perspective. All religions are made on earth by humans, and they constantly change. The Judaism of today is a completely different religion than the Judaism of biblical times. You know, in biblical times, Judaism was quite similar to the other Middle Eastern religions of that age. It was centered on a caste of hereditary priests who sacrificed mostly animals to one god or several gods in a temple in order to get help from that god in fighting wars, in protecting crops from disease, in getting rain, in curing illnesses. This was the deal. This was religion. There was no Torah at the time. There was certainly no Mishnah or Talmud. There were no rabbis. Most of the prayers, most of the customs that are today considered the essence of Judaism didn't exist at all. And when you talk about the wall, one of the funny things as a historian, when I look at the struggle about the wall, I would say maybe a bit like Freud, that one of the reasons that Orthodox Judaism is so concerned about the wall is that it's kind of a place where they hide a very big secret. They hide the fact that they themselves were once radical revolutionaries, far, far more radical than Anat in what they demanded and what they did. I mean, they created an entirely new religion. The Judaism of the rabbis, in contrast to biblical Judaism, there are no priests. There are Kohanim, but they have no real central function there. It's all about studying the scriptures and praying and so forth. There are no sacrifices. If a Kohen Gadol from the temple era would come today to Bnei Brak or to Mea Shearim, he would have absolutely no idea who these people are and what are they doing and what connection do they have with me. It's always the case that we today, we can cast the people in the past to any role we like. We are like the producers of a movie, and we can take the dead people from the past and assign them to roles, and they are dead. They can't say, hey, but we didn't think about it. We don't want to play. No, they have to, because we are alive and we can tell them what their role is. But the Judaism that is today considered orthodox is a completely different religion. And they pay their respects to the religion they replaced, but they hide the fact that it's a very different show. And, in a way, what Anat is asking is just, to take the Orthodox religion and broaden it a little. abolish some of its unfair discriminations and biases. He doesn't want a completely different religion. But what happened at the wall is the disappearance of the biblical religion and its replacement by something completely different. So this is how things look from my perspective as a long-term historian. And of course, this is not unique to Judaism. Also, the Hinduism of today and the Christianity of today are completely different religions than what they were 2,000 years ago. And this is how religions survive. It's not bad, it's adapting. What can't adapt cannot survive. And you know, when their economy changes, when the technology changes, the religion has to adapt or it will disappear. And at the center of the struggle of the women of the wall, there is a technology, an ancient technology of writing and of scrolls and parchment. I mean, this was at the time a revolutionary new technology, like the Silicon Valley of ancient times, writing. And writing on easily portable things like parchment or paper. So this became, that technology became the basis for a new kind of religion. And we also mentioned the Pope, it's the same. You know, 200 years ago, the Pope was a non-entity. He was the theocratic ruler of a tiny place in central Italy. That's all. Nobody cared about the Pope. The Catholics didn't care about the Pope. Then came along modern technology. People think that modern technology is all about Bill Gates and Zuckerberg. Modern technology is also about the Pope. The Pope became one of the most powerful people in the world, first of all because of radio, and later because of the new mass communication technologies of the 20th century. You had this old man in the Vatican in Rome. Suddenly, you know, for hundreds of years, he had no way to access the millions of Catholics around the world. If he wanted to say something to Catholics in the Philippines or Mexico, he would have to send a letter that would take weeks and months to get to the Philippines, to some bishop, and then who knows what the bishop would do with it. Then radio came along, and suddenly the Pope sits in Rome, they bring him a microphone, he speaks, and hundreds of millions of Catholics all over the world immediately hear him. And this is what made him one of the most powerful people in the world. And this was a revolution. But I'll just end by saying that in religions, usually every revolution has to be cloaked as a return to original roots. Because religions have this claim for eternal truth, they cannot admit that they are doing something new. So the trick is almost always the same. We are not doing anything new. We are actually doing something very, very old, so old that people forgot it. So we are just going back to the origins. We are not doing anything new. And that's fundamentalist revolutions. But almost always, these supposedly old things, they are new inventions. And if religions would be more honest about it, they would also be more open, I think, to other changes.
I mean, that's the crux of the problem within religions, definitely within Judaism. And you can tell me if it exists and how much it exists within other religions. You say that the religions are going to have to adapt to new technologies and new world trends in order to survive. And the fundamentalists / extremists argue that the only way to survive or for a religion to survive is for it to remain authentic and for everybody to do everything the way that it always has been. Is there going to be any resolution to that struggle within each religion?
Yeah, I mean, usually the one solution is human sacrifice. Human sacrifice has always been at the center of almost every religion, and it's a common mistake to think that Judaism or monotheism abolished human sacrifice. They actually made it more common than in almost any other religion. What you usually do, you have to adapt. Otherwise, you don't survive. So you change many things, but you take one thing, which seems like it could be a very minor thing. When you read the scriptures, it could be a very minor thing or even a non-existent thing. But you hide all the other changes you do by focusing on one particular issue, magnifying it. And the best way to magnify an issue is to kill people for it, or to cause people a lot of suffering. Human sacrifice is not just Canaanite priests killing babies for the Moloch in Gai Ben Hinnom, the Gehenna. You know, the Spanish, when they come to the Aztec Empire, they're horrified that the Aztec priests are sacrificing humans to their gods in the most important religious ceremonies of the Aztec religion. And at the same time, exactly the same Spaniards are sacrificing more people in the central plazas of their cities and towns. They are burning heretics. They are burning conversos in a religious festival to show how loyal we are to our religion. They are exactly like the Aztec priests. They are just doing it on a larger scale. And you can interpret many other things, like the persecutions of LGBT people, or like the violence against the women of the wall, through this central theme of human sacrifice. There is no more effective way to show your zeal for a religion and thereby hide all the changes you allow than to use violence and to take a group of people, usually a minority, and use extreme violence against them. This is your credentials, that we are not really, look, we are so zealous, we are so loyal that we are even willing to sacrifice people for it. And this is your credentials that then hides all the much more important changes that you yourself are making to the religion.
Well, Anat, I'm very glad for you that the human sacrifice of people that the extremists consider heretics is off the table, at least for now, although you face certainly a great deal of violence at the wall. So while we're talking about women of the wall, can we discuss why the conversation about religious extremism in Judaism, but also in Islam, Christianity, and probably a lot of Eastern religions as well, always seems to come back to women and their sexuality, or has so much to do with women and sexuality? Why are religions so obsessed with women and restricting / oppressing them? And I'd also like to bring into the conversation non-heterosexuality, LGBT behavior. Why do extreme versions of religion have such a focus on women and on forms of sexuality? Yuval, I'll start with you, and then Anat, you can add.
I'll be very happy to hear what Anat has to say about it. I'm not an expert. What I can contribute, as from a historical perspective, is that many of these religions emerged as agricultural religion, and the central theme they focused on was production and reproduction. Originally, it was about the productivity of the fields and the flocks. This is the main thing that God was supposed to ensure, but also the productivity of women to control human reproduction. And you see it in many religions that emerge at that time of the agricultural revolution, the focus on controlling reproduction. And to control reproduction, you of course have to control the body of women. You have to control female sexuality. And you usually also have to oppose, or at least to control, all kinds of other sexual practices. So that's my view from the long-term historical perspective, but of course there is much more involved.
Anat?
I want to go back to the idea of human sacrifice. Thank you, Yuval, for this idea. I think that there is human sacrifice happening in Israel today, in that ultra-Orthodox boys are exempt from core curriculum. I think it's a human sacrifice in that they grow up to be unemployable adults. If you don't study math and science, if you don't study civics, and most importantly, if you don't study English and you don't know how to write your own name, and you're not so strong at multiplication and division, and you don't know where the enter button is on the computer, you're basically unable to function in a modern world. And ultra-Orthodox boys don't study core curriculum. And as a result, they can only work in religious services, religious professions. They can be shochatim, they can work in slaughterhouse. They can work as technicians in the Shatnez laboratory. They can be rabbis, they can teach Torah, but they cannot do things in the modern world. Girls, however, Israeli ultra-Orthodox girls study core curriculum. They're not exempt. The result is that they are educated. They are the ones who are winning the bread. I'm not saying bringing the bacon. And they are growing in their stature in the family. That changes the ultra-Orthodox family. The 6.15 children of an average ultra-Orthodox family, when they want to know what a mortgage is, or how to write a check, or how does the post office work, they go to mom. Mom knows English, mom knows math. As a result of this, the status of the man in the family is changing. This worries the rabbis no end. And as a result, Israel has been propelled in the last 15, 20 years into an obsession with modesty. You think you're so smart? You don't talk on the radio. You think you're so clever? You sit in the back of the bus. All these examples of segregation, silencing, and discriminating against women are of the last 20 years and becoming very, very prevalent in Israel. And I think it's connected to how the rabbis are worried in the difference between the education of women and men in ultra-Orthodoxy. And it's the first time you've given me the words, Yuval. I never thought of denying the education from so many capable ultra-Orthodox boys as a human sacrifice.
To follow up on that, Anat, do you think that, you know, we are a diasporic religion who all of a sudden got a sovereign state? Do you think that the forces giving Jews a state of their own have propelled us towards empowering religious extremism in a way that it was never able to be empowered when it was in a diaspora situation?
Yes, yes. I think we come from a tradition of a tremendous, a live core of arguing. And if you look at the Bible, there are such wonderful arguments there, particularly with God. You look at the first Jew, Abraham, how he argues with God like a used car salesman. How many just people can be in Sodom and still save Sodom? And then it goes on, the prophets argue with God, and the leaders argue with the prophets, and everyone wants to resign, and God wants to resign. And Moses says, I'm not the nursemaid of these people, I want to drop them. And this argumentation continues with the Talmud. In the Talmud, there are huge amounts of argument over every little thing. And I pride myself that we come from such a tradition of a live core of arguing. And every Friday night at my dinner table, I have a living example of the same thing. And we were arguing religion for thousands of years until we came to the state of Israel, and all religious affairs were given to one minority zealot group of Judaism. And the argument ended. We are no longer competing in the free market of religion in Israel. There's just one national religion, it's Orthodoxy. There's only one product on the shelf, Orthodoxy, and many Israelis reject it. And in order to excel, Orthodox rabbis have to become more and more zealot. They have to show that they are more zealot than another rabbi. One rabbi would say, oh, my rabbi is so religious, he doesn't meet with women. Oh, my rabbi is even more religious. He doesn't speak to any woman who's not his sister, his daughter, or his wife. And they're becoming more and more zealot and more extreme because they're not in the free market. I'm just pointing out, I'm sure you know that the chief rabbis of today are the sons of the chief rabbis of yesterday. Since when does Judaism give a handout leadership this way? You have to create your own rabbi. So I think that the monopoly, the ultra-Orthodox monopoly, has actually deadened something wonderful and alive and creative in Judaism. And I'm sorry about that.
Yuval, do you have any insights into this interplay of the power of the state, the power of religion, and I have to put into it money, wealth, the combination?
As long as Jews were in the diaspora without political power, then Judaism was one of the most mild and humble and tolerant religions because it had no choice. If you look at Judaism in biblical times or in times of the Second Temple, then it wasn't like this. It was often a very violent religion, both against outsiders. And Judaism is maybe the first, maybe the only religion that genocide is still in the books as a religious commitment against the Canaanite people. The 7 peoples of Canaan, there is a religious commitment to exterminate them. So it was a very violent religion, also against Jews. If you look at the internecine warfare and terrorism towards the end of the Second Temple period, once Jews were in the diaspora and they lost political power, they also naturally became much more mild in their behavior and less violent. Once you again have a state and you have political power, then the option of becoming violent and of becoming intolerant again is possible. And we are still in a somewhat better situation than the most extreme scenes we have seen in ancient Judaism, but the trend towards violence and towards intolerance is very worrying. And in general, whenever you unite political power with religious power, it tends to, there is this famous saying that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And it's true of individual people. It's also true of religions, that once you give them political power, it tends to corrupt them in many ways. And we see it today, not just in Israel, we see it in many other places. Look at Russia and what's happening there as Orthodox Christianity, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, is becoming the handmaid of the Putin regime. You look at Catholicism in a place like Hungary or Poland. You look at Shia Islam in Iran. You look at Sunni Islam in Saudi Arabia. It's all the same story. And I don't think that any religion is really protected from it unless you separate it from political power. There is a lot of good arguments to separate religion and the state for the sake of the state and the citizens. But there are also very good arguments to separate religion and the state for the sake of religion. That usually when you give religion and religious leaders too much political power, it doesn't end well for the religion. It becomes politicized. That's just the way things are.
I'm reacting as an American where we have absolute legal separation of church and state, and yet religion and churches are very politically powerful. So it's a very kind of tricky maneuver to try to separate religion and power, even if you legislate against it, as you do in the United States. Just to take a turn for a moment, many people say, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. And to get personal, Yuval, you're known for being spiritual, although not necessarily affiliating with practicing an organized religion. I've heard you speak in interviews about your meditation practice, which is Buddhist style, but not necessarily, you're not officially affiliated with Buddhism. Spirituality has a great image, and religion does not necessarily have such a good image, particularly because of what we're discussing, which is extremism. Is there such a thing as spiritual extremism? Is more spirituality always good, or do you make a distinction between religious extremism and spiritual extremism?
There could be spiritual extremism, but it's not so harmful. Some guy going to a cave and sitting there for 20 years, practicing meditation and eating roots. Many people would say this is extreme, but it's not harming anybody. The problems,
as long as he's not married.
the problems begin when you give extremists a lot of political power and power over other people. If it's just their own practices, then we can disagree with certain practices, but it doesn't pose a danger to other people. And I think we should, first of all, maybe distinguish what's the difference between religion and spirituality, because they do have connections. And at the core of many religions, all religions, there are spiritual practices and ideas. I would say in brief that spirituality is about questions, whereas religion is about answers. Spirituality is when you have some big question that bothers you as a human being. Who am I? What is the meaning of life? What is good and what is evil? Questions like that. And you are willing to go on a quest to find answers, or to at least engage with these questions. And you try different practices, you travel around the world, you meet people, you look for answers. That's the spiritual quest. Religion is about the answers, and it's when somebody comes to you and say, this is the answer, you must believe this, you must accept this. If you don't believe that, you're a bad person, you'll go to hell, or you'll be punished in some way, or I'll burn you because you don't believe in our answer. And that's the core of religious establishments, is the unwillingness to engage openly with these questions. No, you have to accept the answer. And there is always this tension that if you think you have found the answer to a spiritual question, then you tend to impose it on other people. And if you have a lot of political power, then that can become very, very dangerous. But I would say that in general, spirituality is an extremely important part of every life, and that a human life that lacks a spiritual dimension is often a poorer life and a more miserable life. But you don't need religion for that. For many people, for millions of people around the world, religion is the greatest obstacle to have a good and deep spiritual life. Because whenever they reach a certain point in their spiritual practice that religion doesn't agree with, they become frightened and they stop.
Anat, do you have thoughts on that? I mean, in all of your very, earthly struggles here in the state of Israel, is it difficult to retain your spirituality?
I'm still stuck on the ear candy we heard from Yuval. I'm thinking about the Manishtana and how Judaism has always tried to encourage our children to ask questions, and that a chatan, a bridegroom on the Shabbat before a wedding, is supposed to give a chidush, is supposed to challenge existing notions and bring something new of his own. And in fact, we reward, at least we used to reward students of Torah for questioning their elders and questioning beliefs. And I think we have that tradition. I wish we could retain it. Ask Manishtana every day. Encourage our children to ask the hardest questions and challenge our practices.
I wanted
I
to
think
time for questions. Oh, go ahead, no, you are.
it's particularly important to have this ability to be critical about our own dark side. That as a person, I know that you can't go very far in the spiritual quest if you think you're perfect. If you think you know all the answers, if you think you're always good, if you think that all the problems are because of somebody else, oh, it's my husband, it's my mother, if they would change, everything would be okay, I'm perfect. You don't get anywhere with this kind of attitude in a personal spiritual development. And it's the same for collectives. If you are a collective, a religion, a culture, a nation, and you go around the world telling to yourself, we are perfect, we are the best people in the world, we never do anything wrong, all the problems, we are always victims, all the problems, it's because of other people, it's because of other religions, and we're the first who thought about this, and we're the first who thought about that, and the Christians, they are stupid because of that, and the Muslims, they are evil because of that, but we are perfect. You don't get anywhere with this kind of spiritual practice. You need to be able to look honestly at your shadow, at your dark side, also as a nation, also as a religion. I don't think that in order to develop as a nation, you need to abandon your past. You don't need to abandon your past. You don't need to abandon your culture. You don't need to abandon your history. Definitely not. You need to be honest about it. I look, for example, at the Germans and the transformation that they have undergone in the last couple of decades. You know, in 1945, a lot of people believed very strongly that the Germans are a basket, they're a lost case. There is something in their culture, in their genes, in the forests of Germany, there is something that makes them authoritarian and violent and militaristic, and there is nothing that can be done about it. And look at Germany today, it's one of the most tolerant and peaceful and democratic nations in the world. And you know, they have the same genes, didn't change their DNA pool, they live in the same place, they have the same forests and weather and whatever, they didn't abandon their language or their culture, but they were, at least some of them, honest about their dark side. Now it was forced on them, and they had a darker side than almost anybody else on earth, but it's still an impressive thing to see. And I think this is the key for the progress of any religion, of any nation. It's easy to see what we are very good at. It's easy to see what the others are doing wrong. But to be honest about our own problems and our own dark side, that's difficult, but that's the most important thing. And you know, there is a tradition of argumentation and self-criticism in the Jewish religion, but there are also a lot of blind spots. I still haven't seen the kind of Jewish inquiry committee. How come we mistreated women for hundreds, thousands of years, and even the recent awakening in this respect, it didn't come to us from studying the Talmud and Torah more closely, it came from outside. Let's be honest about it. The changes in the situation of women in the Jewish world, even in reform and conservative movements, I'm not just talking about the ultra-Orthodox, they mostly came from outside. The ideas came from the secular feminist movement, from the universities, from the outside world. And once you had these ideas, then yes, you could go back to religious traditions, to Jewish traditions, to Jewish scripture, and find there a lot of things that supported these views. But historically, it didn't start there. And I would like to see some kind of you know, inquiry committee. What happened? What's wrong? Why didn't it come from us?
Anat, would you like to see such a committee?
Absolutely. I hear that we have questions from our audience.
Yes, we have a lot of questions. I want, though, my last official questions before I go to the audience. I think it's important to address the conflict between religion and democracy, since we're talking to a mostly American audience. We're here in Israel, all over the world, you know, through very modern history. People have struggled to reconcile their religion and their principles of democracy and human rights. Now, I know in the Yuval Noah Harari universe, democratic values and our religion are both stories that we tell ourselves. But what happens when these two stories, which are very important to some of us, especially those of us in the audience who are Reform Jews, committed Reform Jews, and also very committed Americans or committed Israelis, committed to both democracy and Judaism. Should we worry about this conflict, valuing one over the other? How do we work this out? These two things that are very important to us, our Jewish identity and our commitment to democratic and values and human rights.
I don't think that there is any essential conflict there. As I said before, I don't think that religion comes down from heaven in some predetermined, unchanging form, and it's, you know, take it or leave it. It changes and adapts throughout its history. Judaism have adapted to many different political situations, political structures throughout its history. You see it already in the Bible. You see it later in the diaspora. You see it today. I don't think there is any essential contradiction between Judaism and democracy, or Islam and democracy, or Buddhism and democracy. It all depends on what we make of these religions. If you make Judaism democratic, it will be democratic. If you make Islam democratic, it will be democratic. I just don't think that there is this unchanging kernel that, well, this is the religion and there is nothing we can do about it. It's much more malleable and adaptable than people tend to think. And I think that there is a lot of, I don't think it's essential. You can have a democratic system, a flourishing, peaceful state, which is secular. In previous centuries, there were a lot of thinkers who thought that, yes, religion is some invented story, but we need it because without a belief in some God and some supernatural powers, we wouldn't have morality. People would kill and rape and steal. So even though it's not true, we need it. Right. It's not the case. Today, you look at some of the most peaceful and prosperous countries in the world, they are also the most secular. And vice versa. Some of the most religious countries are the most violent and most poor. So democracy doesn't need it essentially, but religions, if they are interpreted in a beneficial way, they can contribute a lot. I think one of the things to remember is that you cannot have a functioning democracy without a strong sense of national solidarity. And you see today in Israel, you see today in the US, the most worrying thing when I look at the US is simply the level of hatred and distrust between different parts of the American public. But if 50 years ago, Americans were afraid that the Russians would be coming to change their way of life, today Americans hate and fear each other much more than they hate and fear the Russians or the Chinese or anybody else. Democrats are terrified that the Republicans are coming to destroy our way of life, and Republicans are terrified that the Democrats are coming to destroy our way of life. And in the long term, you cannot have a democracy without national solidarity, without people trusting and caring in their neighbors. You can have a civil war, you can have a dictatorship, you can't have a democracy in such a situation. So I know some people think that, say, nationalism and democracy are opposites. I don't think so. I think, again, nationalism, not in the sense of hating foreigners. But nationalism in the sense of loving your compatriots and caring about them, it is essential for democracy. And religion is often, can be, one of the foundations of such national solidarities. Countries, usually small homogeneous countries, in which everybody believes in the same religion, they usually have an easier time with establishing national solidarity and therefore also with democracy. In more diverse countries like the United States or like Israel, it's a bigger challenge. I think if we cast religion in the role of the evil guy that we need to fight, that's a mistake. We need to see how religion, even if you have a diversity of religions in a country, how it can nevertheless, because they do have common values usually, how you can find this common ground and use religion as a basis for national solidarity. That's a more promising approach than to have this fantasy that we can just abolish religion completely and then we'll have an easier time building a democracy. Mm-hmm. I think that, again, practically, historically, it's the wrong way to go because religions and religious people are not going to disappear anytime soon.
Yeah. We have very little time left for audience questions, but what we just discussed, it has a good transition into one of them. I'll direct it to Anat. The question is, how do you think Israel can assert its identity as a Jewish state without oppressing or marginalizing non-Jewish populations?
Well, the first thing to do is to break the Orthodox monopoly over religion in Israel. I think if we had free competition in the market of religion, if there was, like Thomas Jefferson said, that in religion, it's the opposite than in politics. In politics, he says, united we stand, divided we fall. In religion, it's the opposite. Divided we stand, united we fall. And tragically, in Israel, we have one united religion, and that's only Orthodox marriage, only Orthodox divorce, Orthodox conversion. Hopefully that will change in the next few days. Only Orthodox Shabbat observance, which means no public transportation on Shabbat. Only one way to worship at the wall, only one way to have a family. These are the only, there's just one national religion. And I think once we change that, and there is an openness towards other religious, other kind of Judaisms, and there are so many interpretations of Judaism, I think there'll be higher tolerance towards the Israeli Muslims, the Israeli Christians, the Israeli Cherkessians, the Israeli Druzim, the Israeli Bedouins, and the Israeli Gypsies, which are all living here together with us and are all minorities. And if anyone should have compassion to what it feels like to be a minority, it should be the Jews. It should be us. So I applaud Yuval's call for a national solidarity. I had a little hope that maybe the coronavirus will bring this about. Sadly, this is not happening. But I think once we have many forms of Judaism in Israel as acceptable practices, we'll see that there are many voices of Judaism, and one of the voices will say, you shall not oppress the minority because you were a minority in Egypt. This appears 36 times in the Bible. Maybe if it's, when it's said so many times, maybe we should listen.
Yuval, do you have a response?
Yeah, I completely agree. Again, it's this kind of imbalance that there is something which is so central in the holy text, not to oppress others, not to oppress minorities, and people ignore it. But then they focus on something which is not even in the text, like not hearing a woman singing. You have women singing in the Bible, and there is nowhere that says that you shouldn't hear it, but suddenly it becomes such an important thing that I'm a big religious person because I don't listen to any women singing. And then this thing that repeats again and again to have social compassion towards the poor, to have compassion towards minorities. This somehow you ignore it completely. And if people just take seriously the 10 Commandments, that would go a long way. Don't take God's name in vain. If you hate somebody, take care of first own your own hatred. Don't blame it on God. To say, I hate this person, Arabs, gays, Reformed Jews, because God hates them. No, that's taking God's name in vain. It's you. Own your own hatred and better do something about it. And it's the same, it says, don't covet your neighbor's field. Even if your neighbor is Palestinian, don't covet the field and the houses of somebody else. It's in the 10 Commandments. But, people can, if they just focus on these things, I think they can find a lot of ground for building democracy on Jewish foundations.
I'll ask this of both of you. Do you think this is possible without, and a lot of the audience members have asked this question too, which is why I'm addressing it to you. Is this possible without divorcing religion from the state infrastructure in Israel? Or do you think that it can be done while maintaining a rabbanut, while maintaining state religious bodies for all of the religions, but mostly for Judaism?
Anat, you want to?
Well, I of course want to dismantle the rabbanut. I don't think we need it. I think that religious services can be given by the 245 municipalities of Israel. And in Bnei Brak, which is an ultra-Orthodox town, I believe that they will hire the people who are very ultra-Orthodox to deliver these religious services to the population. But in Tel Aviv, I can see a lesbian rabbi like my colleague, Rabbi Noah Satat, becoming the rabbi that fits, because Tel Aviv is considered one of the gay-friendly cities in the world. And once people realize that there are many ways to have Judaism, that Judaism is not becoming poorer, but becoming richer by having new ideas and new forms of practice, I think that would free us. I like it that it's a Jewish state. I like the fact that we speak Hebrew. I like the fact that Shabbat is our day of rest. I don't like the fact that on Shabbat, anyone who doesn't own a car or is in some way handicapped and unable to drive is incarcerated in his home. That's not how I would like Shabbat to be observed. I want Shabbat to be a special day for all Israelis, all the Jewish Israelis, and of course, I respect the other days for the non-Jewish population of Israel. So I would have the Ministry of Religious Affairs become a pluralistic, tolerant, egalitarian ministry, and I would dismantle the chief rabbanut.
Yuval, I know you don't like to take political positions, but do you have a take on this?
Yeah, I think that it's unlikely we'll see the separation of state and religion in Israel anytime soon. So at least we can aim to have a more pluralistic religion. That, okay, it's a Jewish state and there is this very strong connection, but Judaism is not just ultra-Orthodox religion, not just ultra-Orthodox Judaism. If we can have a more pluralistic Judaism, this will go a long way to solving many, if not all, but many of the problems that are related to this mixture of state and religion.
Well, I could keep going for hours. I don't know if you two could, but unfortunately, we've reached the end of our hour. Yuval, do you have any closing thoughts on religious extremism, on religion in general, and on this unique time that we're living in?
As I said, I don't think that religion is a force for evil in human history. It has done a lot of good, it has done a lot of bad things. It depends on us, on what we make out of it. It's a tool. And it's a tool that should serve humans and not enslave them. And unfortunately, again, this tendency of extremism, I'll go back to my opening remarks. It's, in a way, it's just laziness. It's, you have all these commitments, all these values, and it's very difficult to balance, so you just take one. And think that by taking this to extreme, this excuses you from doing all the other stuff. And it's always the case in human history, not just with religion, that this kind of laziness is dangerous. I spoke earlier about nationalism as a force for good, as the basis for national solidarity, even for democracy. It's the same. Nationalism is a force for good as long as it is balanced with other identities and loyalties. I'm loyal to my nation, and at the same time, I'm also loyal to my family, to my profession, to truth, to beauty, to the whole human race. I have a lot of loyalties. Now, of course, when you have a lot of loyalties, you have dilemmas, you have conflicts. What happens when the national interest pushes you in one direction, but your family interest or the interest of humanity or of truth is pulling you in a different direction? So it's difficult, but life is difficult, so deal with it. Sometimes you prefer the national interest. Sometimes you prefer truth, or you prefer your family interest. And that's life. It's a constant struggle to find the right balance. When people become lazy, they become extremist. They say, no, you just have one loyalty, just the nation. Do whatever is in the national interest always. That makes life easier because there are no dilemmas anymore. If your national interest demands that you kill millions of people, then kill millions of people. If your national interest demands that you lie, that you sacrifice the truth, then do it. And this is what we call fascism. The difference between fascism and nationalism, the good kind of nationalism, is that nationalism recognizes the complexity of life and the fact that human beings have a lot of loyalties at the same time, and it's okay. Fascism happens when they tell you, no, you have just one identity, the national identity, you have just one loyalty, the loyalty just to the nation, nothing else matters. And that's when it becomes dangerous. And that's true, and everybody in your personal life, you have to juggle these different balls. You have a relationship with a man or a woman who are your spouse. Maybe you have kids, you have relationship with them, you have friends, you have neighbors, you have your commitments at work, and they are pulling you in different directions. If you say, forget about all this, I'm committing 100% just to my work and everybody else can go to hell. Or I'm committing 100% only to my children and I don't care at all about my spouse or my neighbors, that's a recipe for disaster. So yes, it makes, life is complicated when you try to balance all these things, but that's life, it's complicated.
Anat is the head of IRAC, the organization that put together this wonderful webinar. I'm going to give you the last word and let you wrap up. But let me just first tell you that it was really a pleasure and an honor to moderate this fascinating conversation. Anat, take it away.
So on behalf of our hundreds of supporters who are listening to us now and watching us, I want to thank you, Yuval. Sharing the windmills of your mind is a pleasure. You are an Israeli I am so proud of, and you have taken your talents, the clarity of your mind, and you're sharing it with the world. It's customary to say the Jewish people need you. I think the world needs you. Sapiens need you. And thank you for this gift that you are sharing so generously with us. And I bid you all good evening. And I'm reminding you that Israel is way more important, way too important to be left to the Israelis. And you are all partners in helping us mend this wonderful Jewish project to make it worthy of its original dream.
Shalom.